Undercover boss grabs breakfast, freezes when the waitress says she hasn't eaten since yesterday. Wednesday morning. The sky was ash gray. A light drizzle misted the pockmarked street, reflecting headlights on its wet surface. Derek Langston stepped out of a black sedan, pulled his beanie low, and adjusted his old scarf. No one recognized him, and that was exactly the point. Branch number 28 of Sunrise Diner, one of the most stable locations, according to the latest quarterly report. Consistent revenue, high customer return rate, but beneath those polished figures, HR had been receiving resignation letters without any clear explanation. Derek no longer fully trusted Excel spreadsheets. What he needed wasn't in the reports. The glass door swung open. The bell chimed and quickly vanished into the thick atmosphere inside. The diner was busy. Most seats were filled, but instead of the expected buzz, the air was strangely subdued. No greetings between staff. No cheerful banter. Only the soft clink of spoons against cups, hurried footsteps and faces, distant and disconnected, as if working in two separate worlds. Derek picked a table near the window, the perfect vantage point. Then he saw her, Cassie, dark brown hair hastily tied at the nape, her apron faded, her steps swift, but her eyes tired. She poured coffee, wiped tables, and greeted new guests at the door, without being told, without needing direction. Meanwhile, her two male coworkers behind the counter, one scrolling through his phone, the other sipping an espresso, didn't even flinch as the kitchen bell rang 3 times. Cassie moved like a shuttle across 12 tables, her hands never still. But the smile on her lips was the kind of smile you learn to wear when you've grown too used to being overlooked. Derek narrowed his eyes. He had built Sunrise Diner from a small food truck in Texas. He knew what a truly well-run store felt like. And this was not it. Something was offbeat. Something that didn't show up in spreadsheets, but was unmistakably clear in that girl's every step. And Derek knew a simple morning, a plate of eggs and a cup of coffee, could be the starting point of a truth that needed to be called by its name. Derek quietly folded the menu after a few silent minutes. He didn't need to look at it to know what he wanted, because what he truly needed wasn't printed on paper. Cassie approached, tray tilted skillfully, still wearing the faint smile that had become second nature. I'd recommend the Sunrise Classic sunny side-up eggs, toast, and sausage. Coffee refills are on me, she said quickly, her voice light and thin, almost melting into the sound of rain falling outside the awning. Derek nodded. Sounds good. Thank you, young lady. And though she jotted it down in a small notepad, then turned to leave. But just then, he called gently, Cassie, right? How long have you been working here? Cassie paused, slightly caught off guard, then turned back and smiled, still that same smile. But this time, something in it sank. Almost 8 months, sir. Still here, mostly thanks to coffee. The words slipped out like a sigh forced into the shape of a joke. Derek tilted his head, his gaze sharpening. What do you mean? Cassie hesitated a moment, then whispered, as if afraid she was already saying too much. I haven't eaten anything this morning. Morning shifts are the worst for tips, especially when we're supposed to split them, but only a few actually get any. Derek didn't respond, but the coffee cup in his hand suddenly felt distinctly cold. The server standing before him, the one handling 12 tables nonstop, no break, no pause she had, just told him she hadn't eaten since yesterday. Not because she forgot, but because she couldn't. And in that calm voice, Derek heard something heavier than fatigue. Resignation. Resignation that fairness was a luxury. Resignation that hard work wouldn't be noticed. Resignation that surviving on coffee was the only way to keep standing. Derek bowed his head slightly, as if imprinting it into memory. That single sentence light, as breath had done what hundreds of HR reports could not. It made him realize it was time to re-examine everything they'd been calling stable. From the window side table, Derek began to look more closely, not with the eyes of a customer, but with the instinct of a man who once counted every spare coin to keep his first restaurant alive. Cassie kept moving without pause, single-handedly covering the entire left wing. 12 tables, nearly 20 guests, left hand pouring coffee, right hand balancing a tray, and a constant smile on her face, even as sweat soaked the back of her uniform. Across the room, Ryan and Jason, 2 male staff in freshly pressed uniforms with bright logos each, handled just 4 tables. When not chatting, they leaned on the kitchen counter, sipping coffee or tapping on their phones. But what made Derek frown was a strange, recurring pattern. Every time a customer in Cassie's section paid by card, she would quietly step back, and sure enough, one of the 2 men would swiftly walk over, grab the POS machine, and complete the entire transaction. No eye contact, No verbal exchange. Cassie didn't react. No annoyance. No questioning. She simply took a step back and moved on to clean the next table. Derek tested it himself. He deliberately paid with a card, leaving a generous tip. And exactly as expected, Ryan approached with a mechanical smile, swiped the card, and disappeared, as if he had never been there. Later that afternoon, sitting in his car with a laptop open on his lap, Derek logged into the POS management system with his highest level access, a privilege only he and a few top executives possessed. It took only minutes. An update appeared, patch 3, pose optimization. Note, automatically process tips under $15 to speed up payment. Approved by D.W. Hayes. Default tip recipient ID R. Langford. Derek sat upright. Air Langford. Ryan Langford. Nephew of Doug Hayes, the manager of Branch 28. With this system patch, any tip under $15 would not be attributed to the actual server, but instead rerouted to Ryan's account, regardless of who actually served the table. Cassie, with no access to the POS machine and no registered handler ID, did not exist in the tip allocation system at all. Derek slowly scrolled down the screen, each line of figures landing like a hammer blow to his mind. A fraudulent system, carefully engineered, approved by the branch manager himself, and it had been operating smoothly for months unchecked. Cassie didn't know. People like her never did. They just ran, worked, smiled, and lived on coffee. Derek closed the laptop. Through the car window, the yellow light from the diner still spilled out as it did every normal evening. But he knew tomorrow would no longer be normal. Not once the silence was broken. Not once the truth was called by its name. And not once those erased from the system were returned to where they rightfully belonged. Derek sat motionless in the car, hands clasped over his knees, eyes fixed on the final ID still blinking on the screen. Langford, tip assigned, 87%. In the system, there was no Cassie. No see more. No transaction data, no invoice numbers, not a trace that she had ever existed in the restaurant's financial records. A full-time employee, serving more than 10 tables each shift. But in the POS system, she didn't exist. Derek opened a new tab, pulling transaction reports from the past 6 weeks. Tips under $15 accounting for over 70% of all transactions, all routed to a single name, Ryan Langford. Beside those cold numbers, Derek could almost see the cups of coffee Cassie had used to replace breakfast. The exhausted afternoons when she still bowed and apologized after a customer complained about slow service. The moments she stood alone cleaning the counter while Ryan wore headphones and Jason chatted on his phone. No cameras needed. No second opinions. The system had confessed against itself. Derek navigated to the software installation log. The timeline was clear. Update date, 38 days ago. Approved by Doug W. Hayes. Note, pilot implementation, optimize morning cash flow. Pilot? Derek muttered, letting out a quiet laugh. But the sound came out like metal striking stone. It wasn't a pilot. It was a blatant theft system, disguised as a management feature. And worse than anything, it had been set up by someone who once sat in leadership meetings, who once promised more transparency and a fairer environment for frontline staff. Derek was speechless. What he felt now wasn't rage, it was a deep, quiet determination, a disappointment more profound than any financial report had ever caused him to lose sleep. He gently lowered the car window and looked back at the diner. Cassie was stepping out the side door, her face hollow from lack of sleep, holding a small food box labeled, "For staff only." Probably a leftover sandwich someone had left behind. She looked around quickly and turned toward the parking lot, completely unaware that the person watching her wasn't just a customer, but the one person who could put a stop to all of this. Derek pulled out his phone, typed a short message to Julia, head of HR. It's at Ahmed tomorrow. Branch 28. Full audit of the POS system. No prior notice. Prepare complete reports and bring the tech team. A pause. Then he added, summon Doug as well. Reason, employee data manipulation. Send. The rain had stopped, but Derek knew the real storm was just beginning. No more reports masked by green-colored charts. No more promises of system upgrades. And certainly no more cold cups of coffee Cassie had to sip in place of breakfast. Tomorrow, everything would be brought to light. Because while a system can lie, a single truth even whispered as the power to make an entire empire stop and listen. Friday morning, the sun rose late, but the real storm was already waiting behind the glass doors of Sunrise Diner, Branch 28. 6:28 a.m. Derek Langston walked in not with a beanie, not in an old coat, not pretending to be just a guest, but as the CEO of the entire restaurant chain, holding in his hands every piece of evidence needed to expose a perfectly disguised injustice. Following behind him were Julia from HR, two audit specialists, and the head of the POS tech department. The glass door closed behind them, leaving behind a silence so heavy it was as if the entire diner had swallowed a block of ice. Cassie was refilling coffee when she froze for half a second. Ryan, so used to holding the pause device like it was his inherited right, was startled and dropped a stack of receipts. Doug stepped out of the office, forcing a polite smile, though his face could no longer hide the concern. "Mr. Langston," Doug began, slightly bowing. "What a surprise this morning." Derek didn't respond to the pleasantries. He simply nodded slightly and gestured to Julia. A small Bluetooth speaker was placed on the cashier's counter. Julia pressed a button. No music, no sound effects, only a human voice, loud and unmistakable in the middle of the diner. "Just have the system redirect anything under $15 to Ryan's ID. Cassie, she has no system rights. Just doing it for show. Oh, doesn't matter what the customer leaves, we handle it all." Each sentence landed like a hammer blow against the thick silence covering the room. Doug stood frozen. Ryan stepped back, gripping the counter's edge, like searching for something to hold on to. Derek stepped forward, his voice calm, but every word forged like steel. "We checked the system. POS Update 3.1 approved by you automatically redirects all tips under $15 to ID, R. Langford. Your nephew takes all the rewards, and someone like Cassie working 12 tables a shift lives off coffee to save money on breakfast." Doug tried to recover. "We were just trying to streamline operations, make it simpler, easier to manage." Derek looked him straight in the eye. Not angry, just a disappointment so deep it hurt to witness. "You sat in your office vaping, approving fraud, and you call that optimization?" He turned to face the staff gathered in the lobby. "Who here kept this restaurant running? Who has no name in the system? Who didn't receive a single cent of the money they earned?" Silence. No one dared speak. Derek turned back to Julia. "Doug Hayes and Ryan Langford are suspended immediately. All access to the POS and HR systems is revoked. Legal will contact them today." There was no applause, but there were no more downcast eyes either. Cassie stood at the far end of the counter. Same old apron, some worn shoes. But this time, she stepped forward, slowly, steadily, without hesitation. Derek saw in her eyes that there was no fear left, only resilience. "Cassie," he said, quiet but echoing far, "thank you for saying what so many have stayed silent about." Cassie said nothing, but she lifted her head high. And in that moment, without a title, without applause, Cassie became the living symbol of what Sunrise Diner had always claimed to value. An ordinary person, brave enough to speak at the right time, because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs to be spoken and heard. Derek didn't walk quickly, but every step he took marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of the next. The soft sound of his shoes on the tiled floor echoed through the quiet lobby, resonating in the hearts beating fast behind the counter and in the kitchen. Julia gently placed a tablet next to the speaker. On the screen was a simple chart, but it exposed the raw truth. Over 600 tip transactions under $15 in the past 30 days. 100% of tips routed to ID. R. Langford. Employee with no transaction ID. C. More. A plain monochrome graph appeared, no flash, no color, just vertical bars that pierced through every excuse ever made. Derek turned to face Doug. His voice wasn't loud, but solid as stone. "You didn't just manipulate the system. You erased someone's existence. You turned effort into empty space. And the only name left in the system was your nephew's, a man who never served more than 3 tables a shift." Doug broke into a sweat, eyes lost, lips moving as if grasping for a lifeline. But no one reached out. Even Ryan had backed away, now standing near the water station, holding an empty plastic cup. Derek signaled. Julia tapped another button on the tablet. A video from the internal camera played. Cassie was seen cleaning 3 tables at once, while Ryan scrolled on his phone. A customer stood to leave. Ryan walked over, swiped the card, gave a polite smile, and returned to the counter. The clip was only 23 seconds, but anyone watching understood everything. One employee did the work, another took the reward, and the entire system looked away. Derek stepped to the center of the lobby. He didn't need a microphone. "Cassie," he called. She was still standing at the end of the counter, hands clasped instinctively. But when she heard her name, she slowly stepped forward. not rushing, not hesitating. Everyone in the diner watched her. No whispers. No one looked away. "Cassie," Derek said, his voice softening, as if speaking to a daughter he never had, "I know the hardest part isn't doing more than others. It's knowing you're being denied what you rightfully earned and still managing to smile." Cassie blinked, and for the first time that morning, she truly smiled. Not the exhausted, customer-pleasing smile, but the kind of smile you wear when you finally know someone heard you. Derek gestured toward the digital board behind the counter. The scrolling message read, "New tip policy, automatically distributed by server ID, transparent, no exceptions." Then he said, "Cassie, starting today, you'll oversee this policy." She paused, surprised. "Me, oversee it?" Derek nodded. "I don't need someone with an MBA. I need someone who once had her name erased to make sure no one else ever is again." The diner was still silent, but not with the hush of resignation. It was the stillness of emotion. No applause was needed. No dramatic announcements. Just a simple acknowledgement, a correction, and someone brave enough to step forward when everyone else stayed back. And just like that, what started as an ordinary morning at Sunrise Diner became a moment that forever changed the rhythm of the system. From that day on, within Sunrise Group, there was a new phrase echoed in every meeting about culture reform: the Cassie effect. And because some transformations don't begin in boardrooms, they begin with a cold cup of coffee and someone brave enough to say, "That's enough." 1 month later, the sky was clear. Soft sunlight filtered through the spring foliage, casting a gentle glow on the front of Sunrise Diner, Branch 28, a place that had once been the center of a silent reckoning and also the birthplace of something quietly, powerfully renewed. Derek Langston pushed the door open. No need to hide. No need to play a role. He was no longer someone searching for faults, but a man returning to witness the right things continuing to grow. The space inside was bright, almost as if cleansed, not just by the lights or the updated furnishings, but by the weightless atmosphere. Servers moved with confidence. Customers smiled, genuinely. Every gesture from pouring water to taking orders flowed like a simple, harmonious symphony. Right beside the cashier, a new digital screen framed in light oak was mounted with care. Scrolling across it were the words, 100% tip transparency, automatic, public, protected. Below it, faintly engraved into a brass plate, no contribution is invisible. No voice is too small. Cassie stepped out from behind the counter. No more wrinkled apron. No more worn-out shoes. She wore a crisp white shirt, hair neatly tied up, standing tall. Her new name tag gleaming on the left side of her chest, Cassie Moore, General Manager. "Good morning, Mr. Langston," she smiled, walking toward him with the calm assurance of someone who knew exactly where she stood and what it took to get there. Derek nodded, his eyes sweeping gently across the room, finally resting on the familiar table by the window. She invited him to sit. The table had a new glass top now, but the view remained the same. The spot where the morning light spilled in, where he once sat quietly listening to a girl confess she lived on coffee to save money for food. Cassie set a freshly brewed cup of coffee before him, her hands steady, eyes unwavering. "Thank you for coming back." Derek took the cup, feeling the warmth spread across his fingertips. He smiled, gazing out the window where early rays of sunlight touched the spotless glass. "Thank you for staying." Cassie tilted her head, her keyed smile unchanged. Derek set the cup down, looked at her for a moment, then said, his voice deep and unhurried, "The most important things in a restaurant aren't on the menu. It's trust, it's dignity, and it's the courage to stand up even when no one believes your voice matters." She didn't respond with words, but that gaze, warm and steadfast, was the deepest answer of all. Outside the window, a gentle breeze passed through. The sheer curtain swayed slightly, then returned to stillness. And in that moment, Derek understood. There are systems built from steel, code, and numbers. But there are places like this little table by the window, built from trust and held together by ordinary people brave enough to speak the truth. Cassie walked away, leaving Derek with his coffee and just the right amount of quiet. He didn't rush to drink. The steam rising from the cup blended with the soft aroma, a familiar scent. But this time, it carried something different. Not because the coffee tasted better, but because it was served from a place that had truly changed. Sunlight streamed through the window, landing perfectly on the corner of the table, creating a long streak of brightness across the polished glass. In that light, Derek saw his reflection, still the man in a simple suit, but now with calm in his eyes, no longer filled with doubt. A young employee passed by, cheerfully calling out to Cassie, "Manager, table 4 is asking about the vegetarian special." Cassie nodded, offering a small smile, then turned to guide the staff with clear, patient instruction. Her voice was steady and confident, the kind of calm only found in those who've stepped through more than one threshold. The threshold of endurance, of silence, and finally, the threshold of speaking up. Derek quietly took it all in. At the end of the counter, a handwritten shift schedule was neatly laid out on a whiteboard. Each name had notes beside it. 15-minute break guaranteed per shift. Lunch shift, free soup and bread for morning staff. Thanks to Lisa for cleaning the lobby on Wednesday. None of the lines were obligations. Every one of them was recognition. On a small wooden table near the kitchen, a vase of fresh white baby's breath sat in clean water. Beside it, an old leather-bound notebook staff feedback journal. Taped to the cover, a handwritten note in blue ink read, "Everyone has the right to speak." Derek closed his eyes for a brief moment. A month ago, this place was a cold wall. Now, it was a mirror reflecting everything he once hoped for. When he laid the first brick of Sunrise Diner, not just a place to sell breakfast, but a place to nourish people who matter, who are seen, and who are valued. Cassie returned, holding a sample receipt. "We just tested adding the shared tip line directly by server ID on the printed receipt. It's clearer for both customers and staff. They seem to like it." Derek nodded. Transparency is a language that never needs translation. They both looked toward the guests, quietly enjoying their meals, unaware that the very chairs they now sat in had once stood as the front lines of a silent battle, a battle for fairness. He turned back, his gaze resting on Cassie. "You didn't just stay, Cassie. You made an entire system listen to someone who was never supposed to have a voice." Cassie smiled, this time without hesitation. "I didn't want to be the bravest. I just didn't want to be the last one living off coffee." And versed. Derek chuckled, softly, a laugh that didn't hide his pride. And right there, at that table by the window, where once sat a cold cup of coffee and a whispered confession, Derek understood. There are restaurants built from steel, supply chains, and processes. But there are places like Sunrise Diner today built from a sentence spoken at the right moment. A place where every server knows they are no longer invisible. A place where breakfast is not just a dish, but a beginning of a life more worthy. And at the center of it all was Cassie, not because she shouted, but because she chose not to stay silent. A morning that seemed ordinary, a cup of coffee, a slice of toast, might not change the world. But it's enough to expose an entire system built on silence and evasion. And then, all it takes is one person brave enough to speak the truth, even if just in a whisper during a busy morning shift. One person who no longer waits for permission to speak. From that very moment, everything began to shift. Not through power, but through courage born on the lowest rung. Because justice doesn't need to scream. It only needs one person strong enough to stand, while everyone else keeps their heads down.